start a brand new chapter. This is our last of 3 chapters. So this week, 2 lectures on the endocrine system and then exam on Monday. That's how we'll do things, okay? So this endocrine system is following the nervous system chapter, and they're kind of similar in a way. So just like with the nervous system, we talked about the chemical messenger was a neurotransmitter, and in order for a neurotransmitter to have an effect, it needs to bind to a receptor, right? Neurotransmitter, receptor. And same thing when we're going to talk about hormones today, a hormone is going to need to bind to a hormone receptor in order to have an effect, otherwise it's worthless. Just like the neurotransmitter is worthless in the synaptic cleft, it doesn't bind to a receptor. Okay, so we're still going to be talking about receptors some more today, but this time hormone receptors. Okay. So then, with this chapter, endocrine system, we're going to be looking at several endocrine glands, and there's some here located in the brain here. There's a hypothalamus, pituitary, and the pineal gland. The one we'll be focusing on the most is going to be the pituitary gland, right? And there's 2 major divisions to it. We'll get to it later. Does anyone know what the major divisions of the pituitary? The who? The anterior and posterior? Yeah, pituitary, absolutely. Yeah, anterior and posterior pituitary. So we'll spend some time talking about some hormones that come from the pituitary gland. We'll talk about the thyroid, not so much the parathyroid, although they're next to them, or on top of them actually. But we'll talk about the thyroid gland. We won't talk about the thymus. We'll talk about the pancreas. Does anyone know a common hormone that's produced by the pancreas? Insulin. Very good as well. Okay, we'll talk a little bit about ovaries and testes, and also about the adrenal glands. So we'll cover most of these. All right. So let's start off with a general overview first of the endocrine system, kind of what its function and what it consists of. So its function is going to be to regulate metabolism, right? So metabolism comes from, the word metabolic rate. We've talked a little bit about that in lab specifically. So when we talk about metabolic rate or metabolism, one of the things that you should always be thinking of is going to be cellular respiration. Okay, every time we talk about metabolism, it's going to involve, in one way or another, cellular respiration. Okay, and then you know that the end of the line of cellular respiration, especially if it's aerobic cellular respiration, is the formation of what? What's the whole goal of cellular respiration? To make ATP. Okay. I felt like that was a long time ago, that lecture, those 3 lectures, but it really wasn't. Okay. And you need to know it because that's 1/3 of your exam technically. Not exactly 1/3, but it's one of the 3 main topics, right, for this exam. Cellular respiration, nervous system, and endocrine are your 3 main topics for this exam. Okay. And endocrine system also is involved in growth and reproduction. What is it made out of? Well, obviously an endocrine gland, right? And again, we're going to be talking about a lot of anatomy in this lecture because you can't help not talking about anatomy for every organ system when we start talking about it. And endocrine glands are referred to as ductless glands. And what I mean by ductless is that the hormone, which I'm going to talk about next, the hormones do not, I'll put hormone up here. Hormones do not empty into a duct. Why? Because they directly are released straight to the blood. Okay, that's what an endocrine gland is, right? Versus an exocrine gland, because we have different types of glands in the body, is what I'm saying. You can call it 2 types of gland, exocrine and endocrine. Okay, again, the endocrine gland releases its constant directly into the blood. So here in purple, that's your endocrine tissue or endocrine cells, and you can see their contents, they're depositing it directly into the bloodstream. And then that hormone is going to be traveling throughout the whole body. Versus over here, the exocrine glands, here again in purple is your endocrine tissue, but however, everything is being dumped into this empty space, and it's going to end up getting out and traveling through a duct. right? This is your duct here, right? And then from here, you probably know that the secretion is usually gonna go to the, like the outer surface or the surface. The contents of a exudant gland. They usually release outside to the body. So for example, common one is the sweat gland. Yes, these are glands, and then the material that makes up sweat is deposited into these ducts, and then the ducts open out to your skin. Okay, so those are duct glands versus ductless. Okay, endocrine gland versus exocrine gland. Endocrine system also involves obviously the hormone, because that's what's being made, mostly made in the endocrine gland, certainly being stored and released there from the endocrine gland. And what are hormones? They're like neurotransmitters in the sense that they are also chemical messengers. Okay, but this time these are chemical messengers of the endocrine system, not of the nervous system, right? The chemical messengers of the nervous system, we call them what? Neurotransmitters, NTs, right? So they're analogous. Hormones and neurotransmitters are analogous. It's just they involve different organ systems. Okay, that's one difference, nervous system versus the endocrine system. Common, again, what they have is a receptor that they must bind to, right? Okay. And again, this chemical messenger, this hormone is going to be carried throughout the body in the bloodstream, and it's going to try to reach its target, and this target has to have receptors specific for it. Just like in the nervous system, right? If you wanted GABA to bind to a receptor, it had to bind to the GABA neurotransmitter receptor. Glutamate had to bind to a glutamate receptor, very specific. So same thing here when we talk about hormones, if we talk about, I don't know, like epinephrine later on, we're going to talk about it, it has to bind to epinephrine hormones. Or when we talk about thyroid, it has to bind to thyroid receptor hormones. The receptor, it has to bind to that. Now we can classify hormones based on their chemical structure. That's what I mean by chemical classification. Okay, based upon chemical structure of the hormone. And there's three main groups. The first one is the amine group, or amine hormones, right? And the other one, the second one is called the peptide hormones. All right, and then the third one is steroidal, but I won't advance it yet. So let's just talk about these for now, then we'll get to the third one. For the amine hormones, what they have in common chemically, their structure is that they're all derived from two amino acids, either tyrosine amino acid or tryptophan amino acid. Okay, they have the same structure. And here are some examples of some enzymes that are made from or based on tyrosine, and one that's based on tryptophan. Serotonin, here in bold, all of these, serotonin, norepinephrine, and epinephrine, these are all hormones. Okay, and again, norepinephrine and epinephrine are derived from tyrosine, and like I said, tryptophan, or serotonin is derived from tryptophan. Okay, and the hormones, and these are just three, there's several other ones, I'm just giving you three as an example. These members that belong to the amine hormone group, they're classified also by solubility in terms of are they lipid soluble or they can be water soluble, meaning they can dissolve in lipids or dissolve in water. Okay, not both. I'm just saying, like, that was a good question this morning. Someone was saying, well, does that mean, for example, norepinephrine is both lipid soluble and water soluble? No, I mean that's what I meant by or. It's either one or the other. And the peptide hormones, right? Peptide is referring to protein, so they're protein-based hormones, right? But the only difference is that the number of amino acids, it can be a lot. It can be as few as 3 all the way to over 200 amino acids long, right? Because again, it can be confusing to students because they're thinking, well, amine hormones, they're derived from amino acids and aren't, peptides or proteins, aren't they derived from amino acids? Yes, they both are, but what I'm saying here is that the amine hormones, they consist of just one type of amino acid, one of these two. Versus peptides, you have a lot more amino acids. Okay. And And the examples here of peptide hormones are going to be things like insulin, glucagon, oxytocin, and growth hormone. Okay. Sometimes in here in these peptide hormones, which are made out of protein, right? You also have some hormones that, although they're made out of protein, they have a carbohydrate also bound or linked to it. Because glyco is referring to carbohydrate. So yes, they're made out of protein, but you have these two, LH and FSH, that have a carbohydrate bound to that protein. And we call these glycoprotein hormones. Okay, they're LH and FSH. Later I'll tell you what LH and FSH stands for. Okay. And those hormones that belong to this category, the peptide/protein hormones, they are usually water-soluble hormones, meaning that they dissolve in water, okay? And we also call these, if they're water-soluble, we call these polar hormones. And this should not be new to you because we covered this, I think, in Unit 1, right? Whenever we said something was polar, that means it's like water, right? And also it's kind of hydrophilic. So we're all saying the same thing, water-soluble, hydrophilic, polar. Remember we talked about the polar covalent bond? So this should be a little bit of a review, okay? So these are all like polar hormones, you can call them. If they are peptide hormones. The next one is the steroidal or steroid hormones. And these hormones, what they have in common is this cholesterol starting material. They're all based on the structure of cholesterol. Here's the general structure of cholesterol. Again, we covered this on the last exam, Unit 1, when we talked about lipids. Remember I told you cholesterol is like a 3 6-member ring and 1 5-member. This is what cholesterol looks like. And the hormones that we get from cholesterol, they look exactly like cholesterol, except the functional groups maybe are different. Like here's a OH, and here there's no OH, it's just double bond with O. But otherwise, they have the same structure. And some examples of some steroid hormones are going to be things like testosterone, some of your sex hormones like testosterone, estrogen, right? They have the sex hormones here, right? Testosterone, estradiol, which becomes estrogen, okay? And then you have some other ones that are non-sex hormones like aldosterone and cortisol, right? And then also even thyroid hormone is a type of steroidal hormone, right? So then you probably guessed it, if they're derived from lipids, from cholesterol, then obviously they can dissolve in lipid. We call these lipid soluble. Okay. And if you're lipid soluble, you're the opposite of water, of hydrophobic or even water loving, right? Or hydrophilic. So instead, these are hydrophobic hormones, or we also call these non-polar hormones. Okay. So again, the only one that consists of either or actually both categories of the lipid hormones and the or lipid soluble hormones and water soluble hormones again is the amine hormones, and then peptides again are only water soluble, and steroids are only lipid soluble. Okay. Let's further classify them based on, I have here, based on action. Okay, and by action, what I'm referring to is, can they diffuse or can they passively diffuse to the cell membrane? Can they passively diffuse CM cell membrane? We're going to classify them based on that. Some can diffuse straight through the plasma membrane and some cannot. Okay, so again, we're going to further define and distinguish polar hormones versus non-polar hormones. Okay, and again, if you base it on water, polar, that means that they're water soluble. Non-polar is the opposite, so insoluble in water. Okay. If you are a polar hormone, you are not allowed to pass through the cell membrane. Why not? Because if you're polar, what is it about polar? If something is polar. Size, you mean? It's possible, but a little bit more than that. What else? Huh? Energy? Oh. How about in terms of charges? Is something polar charged? Yes, it is, right? Something that's polar is charged, either positive or negative. Polar means, remember, positive or negative. If something is charged, if something is an ion, if something is either positive, negative, is it allowed to go straight through the cell membrane? No, remember, because it's charged, we said it can't. Remember, it had to go through these channels or facilitator. Remember the facilitated diffusion, right? Again, because they're polar, they are not allowed to go straight through. So these hormones also are not allowed to go straight through. Okay, and remember, I told you in order for a hormone to have an effect, it has to bind to its receptor. So if this is a polar hormone, is its receptor going to be in the inside of the cell or outside? If the hormone can't get through, its receptor better not be inside the cell. Its receptor needs to be outside. So yes, the receptor is found on the cell surface if you are a polar hormone, right? It doesn't make any sense for the receptor to be inside the cell. Okay, it has to be on the outside for all polar hormones. The receptors are found on the cell surface. Non-polar hormones are the opposite. If you are non-polar, meaning you are not charged, if that hormone is not charged, can it go straight through the cell membrane? Yes, it can go straight through the cell membrane. Can enter the cell directly. Passes through the cell membrane. Again, why does it pass through the cell membrane? Because it is not charged. It is not polar. Okay, this is a little bit of a review of our transport chapter that we went over, right? And by the way, something that's non-polar, which is the same thing as water insoluble, means that it's lipophilic. Because it can go through, it loves to be in lipids. Okay, we call this lipid soluble. Okay, so be comfortable with the terms. Okay, lipid soluble versus water soluble. Okay, and again, these hormones are going to pass directly straight through the cell membrane and into the cell. And I just told you a second ago, if a hormone has to have or is going to have an effect, it needs a receptor. So where's the receptor going to be found? Is the receptor for non-polar hormone going to be on the surface? It better not be, because the hormone is inside, and if the receptor is outside, then that hormone is a waste. You know, there's nothing, so the receptor has to be inside, and it is. The receptor is going to be found inside the target cell, and by inside, you'll find out. We won't get to it today. We'll talk about non-polar hormones on Wednesday, but the receptor can be either in the cytoplasm of my target cell, or in the nucleus of the target cell. Okay, but that receptor must be inside so that hormone can bind to it and have an effect. Otherwise, again, it's just a waste of time. All right, and we'll be talking more about these the surface receptors versus the internal receptors on Wednesday a little bit more. Okay. Let's talk about the endocrine glands and then the hormones that come from these specific endocrine glands now. Starting with the anterior pituitary. And again, a lot of anatomy kind of overlaps with this, right? And you recall the anterior pituitary is in the brain, right? It says here it hangs from the base, but it kind of hangs from the hypothalamus. You have the hypothalamus up here, and this thing kind of hangs like a punching bag, like a boxing bag, right? And that's your pituitary. And remember, it can be divided into anterior and posterior. I'll just abbreviate pituitary, right? Anterior pituitary versus the posterior pituitary, right? And the anterior pituitary is responsible for synthesizing or producing and also storing and releasing, whatever, secreting, same thing as release, 6 different hormones that we're about to talk about next. First, one of the hormones that anterior pituitary makes and stores and secretes is going to be growth hormone. We call it human growth hormone. Okay, HGH, little h usually. Okay, sometimes I say a capital H, but it's usually little HGH, growth hormone or human growth hormone. Okay, and what is the function of human growth hormone? Well, like the thing tells you, it's growth, body growth. So that's what controls body growth, especially like in developing individuals, right? You don't have to know this, but from anatomy, remember the tip of the bone? Was that the epiphysis? What's the, whatever they're called. But yeah, it's because it's epiphyseal plate. Remember like you had the diaphysis in the middle, didn't you? Epiphysis. Remember the epiphyseal plate? There was a lot of cell division there, and that's what gives you the longitude so the bones can grow, right? So it affects all that area, human growth hormone, right? And it's going to target, like I said, especially bones, right? But also muscle and some fat, adipose tissue. I asked my morning class, don't some people take like human growth or growth hormone supplements? People like bodybuilders and stuff. Anyone a bodybuilder? I used to be, no, just kidding. But I think some people do take like these supplement pills, and they're like called growth hormone. I've seen commercials for it. But yeah, it builds up, I think, muscle as well. So it basically builds up things, growth of things. Okay, that's what human growth hormone does. Another hormone secreted and produced by the anterior pituitary is TSH, known as thyroid stimulating hormone. Okay, and thyroid stimulating hormone basically is going to stimulate, like a thing is telling you, it's going to stimulate who? The thyroid gland. So the thyroid gland can release thyroid hormones. Right? So basically what's happening here is that the anterior pituitary, I'll put the tissue in the box, anterior pituitary releases TSH, the hormone, and then TSH, I'll just do it the other way over here, I'm not real. Then TSH is going to stimulate, I'll put a little plus to stimulates the thyroid gland. Put this in a box, the tissue always goes in a box. And then thyroid gland, we said, secretes what? Thyroid hormone. So one thing stimulates, one tissue releases a hormone, that hormone stimulates one tissue, and then that tissue in response releases another hormone. It's like a chain of events, right? Again, anterior pituitary releases TSH, TSH stimulates thyroid gland releases thyroid hormone, and then this thyroid hormone, you know, who knows, some other target tissue. Has an effect, stimulates some target tissue, whatever that may be, etc. Okay? ACTH is another hormone released by the anterior pituitary, and it stands for adrenocorticotropic hormone. Kind of a long word, right? Adrenocorticotropic hormone, right? This cortical part and adrenocortical part is referring, remember from anatomy, the adrenal gland, right? Remember the adrenal gland? We'll talk about it a little bit later some more, but the adrenal gland, it says gland, right? It says gland. Had the middle part, and then, remember it was called the medulla? I'll get to it in a moment. Remember it had the medulla in the center, and then the outside cortex. Cortical means outside, like a cork, or, cortex, outside. So that part from the adrenal gland, the cortex part, is what releases this hormone. And they're even telling you what hormone. Look, it says adrenal, as an adrenal gland. This is referring to the adrenal gland. Okay, and releases ACTH. Okay. So once again, if I do kind of like my little schematic again, so I have the anterior pituitary releasing ACTH. ACTH is going to stimulate the adrenal cortex. Okay, and this adrenal cortex is going to end up secreting some other hormone. A hormone. I won't mention it just yet, but it can do several different things. Like cortisol, this other stuff. I'll get to it. Okay? That's the first three. Three more to go, because I told you it was 6 total, right? So the next one is going to be prolactin. Common abbreviation is PRL, right? When I see the word prolactin, I focus on lact, like in lactose. When you think of lactose, what do you think of? It's a sugar. It's sugar found in what? In milk. It's milk sugar. Because milk has sugar. Okay, lact means milk. So prolactin, right? So this is responsible. This hormone is responsible for the synthesis of milk in the mammary glands. Okay, production or synthesis, right? And then you have also next is the FSH, which stands for follicle stimulating hormone. And a lot of people, even when I was like younger, when I first started studying this, I thought FSH only affected females, but it also affects males as well. It has an effect there. In females, it stimulates the maturation of the ovarian follicle and the ovum. Okay. Here, what I'm talking about, what's an ovarian follicle, first of all? Does anyone know what an ovarian follicle is? We won't have time, I don't think, in this course to go through like deep reproductive physiology. It's incorporated here and there, a little bit here, but not so much. I wish we had time, but I can't add another chapter to this. So, anyhow, the ovaries. They have these on their surfaces. These are called follicles. Every ovary, female has 2. This is an ovary, sorry. Oh yeah. The whole thing is an ovary, sorry, I was right the first time. Follicle, I meant. Okay. Inside the follicle, guess what's inside the follicle? Ovum, also known as egg. Okay. These follicles have to mature to release an egg, and this happens every month. Okay, and that's part of ovulation in the female. Okay. FSH makes sure all that happens. Not the ovulation part, but they make sure that the follicle matures, right? And if the follicle matures, then the ovum matures as well. Okay, and it will only get released when the follicle matures. Okay, really interesting female reproductive part because, there's already a certain, you don't have to know this, there's already a certain set or a certain number of follicles in a female's ovaries. Even a baby female when she's born, it's already a determined number, right? And if you do the math, during the reproductive years, and you only release one at a time, like hundreds of thousands never get released, technically speaking, ever. It's just a select few, because females don't live forever, right? And you have plenty, to go around. It's just, you don't live 100 years or 200 years, to do all that. It's just whatever, 30 years or whatever, the reproductive years. Anyhow, that's the story of FSH. That's in the females. Well, males don't have ovaries, I don't think they do, right? So they must do something else. In males, FSH stimulates the maturation of sperm. Okay. So the whole thing with FSH involves some sort of maturation, right? They both involve maturation. Easy to remember. Okay, but they do have an effect on males as well. Luteinizing hormone, LH, is another hormone by the anterior pituitary, and this is the one that's responsible for ovulation in females, LH. Okay. Yeah, I would love to, if we had time to talk about reproductive, because you get with these FSH and LH, especially in the female reproductive cycle, talking about the menstrual cycle and the uterine cycle, very interesting how they play a role and stuff like that. I don't think, maybe in lab, but I don't even think in lab we have a reproductive lab, do we? I don't think so, but anyhow, at least you heard a little bit of something in it, okay? And in males, also luteinizing hormone has an effect, and this is responsible for the secretion of testosterone. Okay. That was the anterior pituitary hormone, 6 of them, right? Starting with what we talked about, growth hormone, TSH, ACTH, prolactin, FSH, LH. I can remember all of them, 6 of them. Well, you can just remember the flat pig. not fat, but flat. Put a little I in there if you want to. The flat pig. F for FSH, L for LH, A for ACTH, T for TSH, P for prolactin, and G for growth hormone. That's all 6 of them. Because you will have to be able to, that's an easy like matching or something like that, very, very easily. Okay, or like with the, I think with the hormones, I'm more inclined to do a matching. That would be a lot easier. I can kill 2 birds with 1 stone. You'll test you on all of them real quickly with the matching. Okay, so know what endocrine gland released them and then their function, just like we've been going over. Okay, but this always helped me. always remember the flat, the flat pig, not the fat one. The I doesn't mean for anything. It just helps me pronounce pig instead of flat pig. So it's flat pig, not the fat pig, but the flat pig. But I doesn't mean for anything but P for prolactin, G for growth hormone. Even though it's called human growth hormone, but it's called growth hormone. Okay, if that helps you, you're welcome to use it. If not, you have to come up with your own. Okay, all right. Posterior pituitary is next. The good thing about posterior pituitary is there's only 2 hormones involved. Okay, and I don't really have an acronym for it. I just remember it in my head. I always remember that they're the ones that begin with vowels. Even though that other flat pig has the A in it, but there's no A in here. Because it's just oxytocin. Oh yes there is. It's ADH, sorry. Okay, you just have to remember. Anyhow, posterior pituitary, it is behind the anterior. That's why they call it posterior, right? And posterior pituitary, those hormones are a little interesting because they're not actually produced by the posterior pituitary. For the anterior pituitary hormones, they were produced by it, but here they're actually produced in the hypothalamus. This area here, you don't have to know the paraventricular and supraoptic. I used to have to know that in grad school, but these are they're not produced, but produced in the hypothalamus. They're produced in the hypothalamus, and then they come down to the posterior pituitary where they're stored and released from. Anterior, it was the opposite. Everything was made here. It was made here, and this is here. They're made here, they're stored here, and they're released all here. But posterior pituitary is a little different. They're not made there. They're just stored and released there. Okay? And again, it's just 2 of them, ADH and oxytocin. ADH stands for anti-diuretic hormone, ADH. We'll be talking about this one a lot when we go into the kidney. That's exam 4, the kidney. Okay? Oxytocin is the second one. Okay? They call it OT, oxytocin. And we talked a little bit about oxytocin in exam 1. We were talking about positive feedback. Remember we were talking about uterine contraction, and I'll tell you more about that. I'll refresh your memory. But anyhow, ADH, basically the function of ADH is to increase water reabsorption, right? You reabsorb water back into the blood. Okay. That's why we say it increases blood pressure, right? Because if you do reabsorb water from your blood, you're keeping the water in you, right? And if you keep the water in your body, that's what blood pressure is. You increase your blood pressure, right? So, like I said, we'll talk more a little bit about this in an exam form. We talk about the kidney, but maybe to help you understand a little bit, this is anti-diuretic, right? Do you know what a diuretic is? Have you heard of a diuretic? Someone's taking diuretic drugs? What's a diuretic? What's the symptom? What are they always going? To pee a lot. A diuretic is something that will make you pee, will make you urinate, to lose water a lot, right? So the anti of losing water is what? Keeping reabsorbing it, keeping it, right? So does that make sense? You're keeping water, you're reabsorbing. The kidney is reabsorbing water for you, and therefore that's why your blood pressure is increased. Going back to the people who are taking diuretic drugs that are making them pee. Why do they want to pee? They're taking these drugs and it's making them pee a lot, urinate a lot. Why are they doing that? They're trying to do the opposite. They're trying to not increase blood pressure, but decrease the blood pressure because they have hypertension, because they have high blood pressure. How they're lowering it is by losing the water that they have. That's how they're lowering the blood pressure. Okay, they're sick people. They have to take these medications. That's why they're always peeing to lower the water volume. Okay, we'll talk all about that in exam 3. We'll have to talk about blood pressure and the kidney because these go hand in hand and stuff. But that's what they're doing. They're losing all that water, and that's how their blood pressure drops. Okay, but that water pill, whatever they call it, what do they call it? Lasix it's called, I think, right? Yeah. Okay. Oxytocin. Remember I told you we talked about this before. Oxytocin basically is good for muscle contraction. I think most of it is smooth muscle contraction, and you have that in the uterus, so that's helpful in birth, right? And also in the mammary glands, you have like mammary ducts, and these ducts have to contract to let the milk out. So we call that release or milk letdown or letdown reflex, right? So don't confuse this with prolactin. The difference between oxytocin and prolactin when it comes to lactation is that prolactin makes the milk, oxytocin releases it. Okay, so they kind of work together. Okay, but they're two different hormones, and they have two different functions, and they come technically from two different glands. I mean, I know we're still talking about pituitary, but one is anterior pituitary, the other one is posterior pituitary. Okay, but their target is still the mammary gland. Okay, so we're done with the pituitary. Let's move on next to the thyroid gland. Okay, and the thyroid gland is pretty much here, like right below your voice box, your larynx, your voice box, around your trachea, your windpipe, right? And it usually involves the uptake of iodine, this chemical called iodine, okay, which is not super important, but it does come up in the name of the thyroid hormone. But anyhow, iodine is a major ingredient of thyroid hormone. When we get to about it, we'll talk about it. There are three principal hormones that are secreted by the thyroid gland. And again, this is my thyroid gland. So here they are for you. They're called T3, T4, and calcitonin. Right? These are three hormones produced by the thyroid gland. Only these two right here are actually what we call thyroid hormones. So, because the word thyroid hormone, that's a very collective term, all right? Because calcitonin is not a thyroid hormone. Calcitonin is calcitonin, period. Okay, and then you have several types of thyroid hormones. I guess that's the best way. Now, I'll get to that more in a second, okay? But again, a lot of people always confuse, a lot of students always confuse that thyroid gland, oh, it produces thyroid hormones. That's true, but it's not just thyroid hormone. What about, don't forget, calcitonin. You have to remember calcitonin as well. Okay? But, you know, here they are. Here's T, like I told you, T4 and T3. The name of T4, the official name is called thyroxine, and T3 is called triiodothyronine. Oh my God, do I have to know them now? On the exam, I'll probably just refer to them as T4 and T3. If you're curious, you don't have to know this. T4 consists of 4 iodines in it. That's where the iodine comes from. If you look at the chemical structure. Guess how many iodines are in triiodothyronine T3? 3, very good. That's why they named it T3, because it does have 3 iodines in it. Okay. I'm not gonna ask you if it's iodine or not. I'm just, you know, this is where the names come from if you were curious. You know, I'm not gonna get into a whole synthesis of how you make. In grad school I had to know that. Okay, but that was a long time ago. That was better days now, right? Okay. So those are your 2 thyroid hormones, like I told you. And like I said, they're made by the thyroid gland, and they have to be different from each other, otherwise we wouldn't be calling them different names, right? Oh, like I said, don't forget calcitonin, also made by the thyroid gland. Let's compare and contrast T4 and T3. T4 actually is the inactive thyroid hormone. It's kind of like a precursor, because actually T4 gives rise to T3. Okay, but T4 is inactive. And T3 is the active hormone. Okay? And the function and the role of T3, again, is going to be to increase metabolic rate, right? So this is the same thing as metabolism. When you increase metabolism, we're talking about cellular respiration again, right? And when you do cellular respiration, at the very end of those 4 stages, glycolysis, oxidative decarboxylation, citric acid cycle, ETC, oxidative phosphorylation, you make energy, right? and this energy either takes the form of ATP or heat. So here's ATP. So this is a correct statement. It does lead to the production of ATP. Okay, that's why thyroid hormone is super important, right? Because you can't live with ATP, because ATP is required. Why do we need to make ATP? It's required for what? To do what? Cellular work, absolutely. Your cells need to do all that transport that we talked about, moving things against diffusion and the sodium potassium pump. How do you think all those things operate? By ATP, right? Because of cellular respiration, right? And who makes cellular respiration possible are things like thyroid hormone. That's why it's super important. That's why you can't live without a thyroid gland. Where's your thyroid hormone come from? You need it. It's essential, right? And calcitonin, another thyroid gland hormone, very easy to remember because it involves calcium. The name even kind of gives it. Even the first part of calcitonin, tells you calcium. It spells out calcium, right? And what it does with calcitonin, actually it decreases calcium levels. Because again, all these levels, you know, they have to be within a normal range, right? Homeostasis. We have to have a normal range of glucose in our blood, right? You can't have too much glucose, you can't have too little, there's gonna be a problem, right? You can have diabetes or something else, whatever going on. Same thing with calcium levels, they have to be maintained within a certain range, right? If your calcium level in the blood is too high, calcitonin comes in to decrease it, right? And then there's another hormone that if it's too low, it'll bring it up, but we don't need to talk about that. I didn't include that in here, okay? And anyhow, yeah, this one decreases calcium levels, right? It also functions in bone formation. Because bone formation, a good part of the bone is made up from calcium. All right, and I kind of like this picture. It was kind of cool because again, these are the 3 hormones coming from my thyroid gland, right? What makes it possible? Who stimulates the thyroid gland to make these thyroid hormones? Thyroid stimulating hormone that we just talked about. And where did TSH come from? Remember the flat pig? It came from the anterior pituitary, right? And later on when I talk about body temperature, even the anterior pituitary was stimulated to release TSH. It was stimulated by this other hormone called thyroid releasing. R stands for releasing. Thyroid releasing hormone that came from the hypothalamus. Okay, so I'll write it up here because I don't have any more room, but just to summarize it for you, right? Hypothalamus releases TRH, right? Which stimulates the anterior pituitary to release what? TSH. TSH is going to stimulate who? Thyroid gland. And the thyroid gland releases what? All these things, T3, T4, calcitonin. Right? And then all of these have a target. You know, calcitonin can stimulate the bone to whatever, and all this other stuff. And it goes on and on and on. Okay? The adrenal gland is next. Okay, and again, you probably know this from anatomy, like the adrenal gland sits kind of on top of the kidney. It's kind of like a little, they call it like a pyramidal shape, right? It has the center part and so forth, right? The medulla and the adrenal cortex, right? And again, the medulla is the central part, while the adrenal cortex is the outer part. Okay. And let's talk about what the adrenal medulla produces. It produces 2 closely related hormones, and they have the same function, these 2 hormones from the adrenal medulla. And they're both, what they have in common, they're involved in the sympathetic nervous system. We talked about that a little bit. I always think about the sympathetic nervous system like it increases things like functions, right? It increases breathing, it increases heart rate. It's that fight or flight thing, right? When you're being chased by a tiger, you're gonna breathe faster, your heart rate is gonna increase, right? You're not gonna urinate or defecate, you don't have time for that, right? So those type of things. So, two examples of hormones that are secreted by the adrenal medulla are epinephrine and norepinephrine. The alternate name, they're really easy, they sound the same. Norepinephrine is the same thing as noradrenaline, and epinephrine is the same thing as adrenaline. Okay, they're very similar, but if you see those, they mean the same thing. Okay, and like I said, these hormones from the adrenal medulla, they're involved in the sympathetic nervous system. What they do is they will target, these two hormones will target the heart, right, and increase heart rate, or they can target this diaphragm. You know what a diaphragm is? It's a muscle that helps you to breathe. It's right below your pelvic cavity and abdominal cavity, right? It's kind of like dome shaped. It helps with the breathing. We'll talk more about diaphragm in exam 4 when we talk about the pulmonary system. Okay, but this is a muscle. And it's responsible for, again, increasing respiratory rate or breathing rate, right? But again, these are like the targets here of the epinephrine and norepinephrine, right? So let me pause for a second. You're probably thinking, wait a minute, didn't we just talk about epinephrine on the last chapter and it bound to this receptor, that G protein receptor and the alpha subunit adenylyl cyclase and blah, 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 and so forth, CAMP and PK and phosphorylate. So I thought epinephrine was a neurotransmitter. It is a neurotransmitter. If it's involves the nervous system and if it binds to an epinephrine neurotransmitter type of receptor, right? Then in that case, yes, it is acting as a neurotransmitter. But if epinephrine came from the adrenal medulla and is binding to a receptor, a hormone receptor, then epinephrine obviously is not acting as a neurotransmitter, it's acting now as a hormone. So it really just depends where it's being secreted from and the type of receptor that it binds to. That will determine whether it's acting as a neurotransmitter or it's acting as a hormone. Okay, but because later on I'm gonna have a bullet point that says some hormones can also act as neurotransmitters. Okay, but I know that can be the confusing part. We're like, wait a minute, I thought it was a neurotransmitter, now you're saying it's a hormone. It can be either or, it depends where it comes from. Okay, the source, it depends on the source. Well, and the target, obviously, as well. Okay, the adrenal cortex, now the outer part over here, this is the cortex, right? This secretes aldosterone and cortisol, right? And the function of aldosterone is going to be to increase blood pressure. And again, when we get to the kidney, we'll talk again more about aldosterone, okay? You don't need to know this, you don't have to write this down, but specifically, actually, aldosterone increases sodium reabsorption. And what happens when you increase sodium, you also end up reabsorbing water. Water is attracted to the sodium. Wherever sodium goes, water likes to go with it. That's why blood pressure increases. And we said blood pressure increases because you're absorbing water. You're keeping it in your system. Okay? And cortisol also kind of does the same thing, increases blood pressure, right? And it also weakens the immune system. Okay? A lot of times when people are very, very stressed out, going through a bad time, they usually secrete a lot of cortisol. They have high cortisol levels in their blood, right? And usually what happens to you when you're like super stressed out all the time? What happens to your immune system? It weakens. Have you ever noticed have you ever been like super, super stressed and you're just getting sick all the time? You have like a cold and you just had one the last week, now you have another one. Or you got the flu. It's because your immune system is weak. Because you probably have a lot of cholesterol. You probably have a lot of cortisol. But you have a lot of cortisol in your blood because you're super stressed out. And it's not, you're not in a good place if that's happened to you because you kind of lost control a little bit of that. And yeah, this cortisol, yeah, it can weaken the immune system. You can get sick very often. Okay, you're gonna be miserable, not very happy person. Okay, that's what cortisol does to you. Pancreas, moving along to the pancreas next. The pancreas, if you kind of remove the stomach, it's going to be kind of behind it, a little bit to the left side. And if I remember correctly, it kind of has this weird shape. It's kind of like that. The pancreas, something like that. Okay. Pancreas is interesting though because it has an endocrine portion and the exocrine portion. The exocrine portion, remember, is ducts, and it releases its contents into these ducts, and they're secreted from the pancreas. You don't have to know this, but do you remember from anatomy pancreatic juice? This is not juice you buy at the market, okay? This is something you make. All right, your pancreas makes. Pancreatic juice, that's all involved in digestion, right? Do you remember, like, there's even buffers in there. It's because, remember, you have to realize that all the contents from the stomach are very acidic, and by the time they get to, like, the small intestine, like the duodenum, all this pancreatic juice dumps in there, I believe. God, what was all that stuff? The ampulla of who or whatever, where they join up. Anyhow, all that area. There was some ampulla or something there that joins like the pancreatic duct to the duodenum, something like that. But see how anatomy comes in handy with this. Yeah, I haven't had anatomy in like 20 years, so yeah. But anyhow, that's all exocrine part. There's also an endocrine part to this pancreas, and it's in pockets, right? Called islets of Langerhans. So probably named after Dr. Langerhans who discovered it. So it's like these little islets. Islets means islands. So these little pockets. These are all your islets of Langerhans. Okay. And this is all endocrine portion, right? They release hormones, right? But there's several populations of cells within these pockets, within these islets of Langerhans. They have, the major ones are these alpha cells, that means alpha in Greek letter, and beta cells. There's some other ones, I'm not going to get into it, but there's alpha and beta cells in these pockets, in these islets of Langerhans. The beta cell is responsible for secreting or producing insulin, and the alpha cell is responsible for producing glucagon, two hormones made by the pancreas. And these two hormones are going to have antagonistic effect, opposites effect to each other. Let's talk about insulin a little bit. Okay, when your blood glucose is high, blood sugar levels are high, that's when you secrete insulin. Okay, if it's high. And insulin, this is the function of insulin. So up here is what triggers insulin production. High blood glucose triggers the release of insulin, and the function of insulin is going to be to lower that blood glucose level. How does it lower it? How does it take it from the blood? Well, it takes it from the blood and it goes into your cells. Cells of the liver and cells of the skeletal muscle. And all that glucose is going to be stored, I've covered this before in the last unit, it's going to be stored as glycogen, right? So you have all of these individual glucose molecules taken in, and they're going to be connected to each other, and you form one big polysaccharide, right, called glycogen. Remember we talked about glucose was a monosaccharide, polysaccharide was a glycogen. Glycogen, again, is a whole bunch of glucoses connected to each other, hundreds, thousands of them. And that's how glucose is stored. And again, this is happening in the liver and skeletal muscle. Okay, and that's what insulin does. Glucagon is going to have an antagonistic effect, the opposite. When do you make glucagon? The pancreas makes glucagon when blood glucose levels are low. Okay, that's when glucagon gets secreted. And what's the function of glucagon? It's going to be the opposite. Function of glucagon is to raise blood glucose levels. Okay, how do you raise blood glucose levels? How do you get glucose in the blood? Well, you take that glycogen that you stored earlier and you start breaking or cleaving a glucose at a time, and you start releasing now the glucose. That's how you increase the glucose levels in your blood. Because remember, blood glucose has to be within a certain range. If it's too high, you can't do that. You have to store that. And only insulin will be secreted. Insulin will help you store it. If it's too low, you need to bring it up, and glucagon will be made to bring it up again, right? I always remember glucagon because I think When do you make glucagon? You make glucagon when glucose is gone. That's why they call it glucagon. Get it? When glucose is gone, you make glucagon. And glucagon will do what? And if it was gone, bring it back up. That makes sense? Yeah, when glucose is gone, you make glucagon. Okay? Let's move over now to, I don't have that much on this part, on this slide right here, on the ovaries, right? They produce several hormones, but the main two are going to be estrogen and progesterone, and these play more of a role like in the menstrual cycle, uterine cycle, and pregnancy, maintaining pregnancy, all this stuff, which I don't have time really to get into so much, okay? But they're all in the female reproductive tract. And testes, again, produce various hormones, and the most important one is going to be testosterone, okay? And again, I like how they saved the work for me, right? Here's your hypothalamus, right? And it's releasing this, you don't need to know what, it's called gonadotropin releasing hormone, but who cares? This R is for releasing. Hypothalamus always releases some sort of a releasing hormone, right? And it's going to stimulate the pituitary to release LH and FSH. Which is this anterior pituitary or posterior pituitary? If it releases LH and FSH. Anterior, right? Remember the flat pig? This is part of the flat pig. This is anterior pituitary. LH and FSH are going to stimulate the ovaries and the testes, right? And the ovary will end up producing estradiol, which eventually gives rise to estrogen. Same thing as estrogen, right? And also progesterone that we have here. And then it stimulates the testes to produce testosterone. Okay. If you have enough already estrogen and progesterone and testosterone, and let's say you don't need to make any more, you need to stop it. How do you stop it? By negative feedback. These hormones here, these three hormones can negatively feedback and tell the anterior pituitary, stop making LH and FSH. We don't need it anymore. Because why don't you need? What's going to happen if you keep making LH and FSH? You keep making more what? You keep making all of these three hormones still. And again, we want to stop it. You have too much. You don't want to have more than you need, because again, everything is homeostasis. You have to have a normal range. I mean, you're going to have some serious symptoms if you have excess progesterone, estradiol, and testosterone. You're going to get like major secondary sex characteristics, or this can lead to stopping menstrual cycle. I don't know, some other stuff. I don't know, a whole bunch of different things can go wrong. So sometimes you need to stop the production of these things, right? So you can feedback at the level of the anterior pituitary, or you can also do negative feedback at the level of the hypothalamus as well. Tell the hypothalamus, hey, stop releasing the releasing hormone. No releasing hormone, no LH, FSH, right? And then you don't get any of this, right? So you understand the feedback part. If you don't need it, then you feedback at the level of the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary. Because after all, it's these two that are contributing the reason why you have these three hormones, right? How do hormones work? Okay. First of all, it has to get made, and then once it's made, it has to be placed into the bloodstream. Once it's in the bloodstream, it has to circulate in there, and it's going to reach the spread all over the body, right? And if it's spread all over the body, it's going to reach its target cells eventually. And I told you, these target cells have to have some sort of hormone receptor. Otherwise, that hormone is going to be a waste. It's not going to have an effect unless it binds to its receptor. And kind of like I alluded to you earlier in the PowerPoint today, there are two major types of hormone receptors. You have surface receptors for hormones, and then intracellular hormone receptors. Okay? And I have here for the surface receptors, what type of hormone binds to these receptors? I don't mean specific ones. I mean just because people were giving me in the morning like specific examples. I mean just general examples. So if I tell you, is it going to be a polar or non-polar hormone that binds to surface? Polar hormone, very good. This is a polar hormone, because remember, do polar hormones go through the cell membrane? No, so their receptor has to be outside. So obviously here the answer for intracellular is going to be who? Non-polar hormones. Okay, their receptors are going to be found inside, and I already told you inside where? In the cytoplasm or the nucleus. Either one. That's where those receptors are going to be located. So yes, the hormone has to bind its receptor, and now that receptor is activated, right? Just like with the neurotransmitter had to bind to its receptor, and that receptor got activated and it opened up or whatever, or it activated the G protein, all that kind of stuff. So receptor is now activated, and then you're going to start this intracellular series of events that we call, remember the signal transduction series of events, the same thing that happened with the metabotropic kind of deal, right? And then your target cell is going to change its activity. Something's going to happen to it. Either it's going to change enzyme activity, or it's going to change like the DNA or gene activity of that target cell. Some additional information about hormones that we need to talk about. Hormones, they're very potent chemical substances, right? So you just need a very small amount. You don't need to make a whole lot. Just very, very tiny amounts, right? For neurotransmitters, you need a lot more, to have an effect. But hormones are pretty potent. Okay, just very small amounts are required, and they usually have very long-lasting effects if you compare it to a neurotransmitter, right? The neurotransmitter effect is going to be maybe a couple of seconds, a couple of minutes, but a hormone is going to last, the effects are going to last like a long, long time, hours, days, weeks even. Okay? This is like a side note. Whenever like someone's like on some hormone therapy and they need to get off, they always tell you to kind of like gradually get off of it, because these effects, they last a long time. You kind of want to taper them off a little bit, because you don't want to kind of stop it drastically. And it has to do with like these long effects of it. The effects also are not immediate, okay? A neurotransmitter is pretty much instantaneously. You start generating, glutamate binds, you get EPSPs, you get an axis potential, everything happens really quickly, like in milliseconds, right? But for hormones, it's gonna take a lot longer than that versus neurotransmitters, right? It's gonna take more like minutes, hours, days to have an effect. And their target, because they circulate in the blood, their target is going to be other body parts or other parts of the body. And again, it's because they circulate in the blood. It's not like the neurotransmitters that communicated right next to another neuron, right? Here again, because again, for the neurotransmitters, for the nervous system, the neurotransmitter didn't have to circulate the body or get into the blood. They went directly into that space and bound to the receptors. Here, hormones have to get into the blood and then find their receptor, right? And like I told you, some hormones are also act as neurotransmitters. It just depends who made them and where their target or where their receptor is located, or what type of tissue on the target cell. But epinephrine, norepinephrine, there's probably others that are also acting as neurotransmitters. And the half-life, what's a half-life? Half-life is basically the time it takes to reduce that concentration of the hormone by 50% by half. Okay, and for this one, for hormones, it takes, again, maybe minutes, hours, or days. For neurotransmitters, it probably is more like minutes, seconds, to break that neurotransmitter. So again, they last a long time. So you don't break them down that easily. There's a long effects. If you're on some medication or some medication regimen that was a hormone, you're gonna still have effects even after you stop the medication for a while. Okay. And like I told you, it's often regulated by negative feedbacks, just like I showed you earlier, right? If you don't need that hormone, then you stop making it. making the hormone if not needed. And like I said earlier a second ago, usually hormones have an effect at a distant site because they're circulating in the blood and their target is way further out. You do have some hormones or some cells that will produce a hormone, and they have an effect on the same cell, right? That's why I say they affect the cell that secreted it, and we call these autocrine hormones. It's like a cell that secretes the hormone, and that target is itself. So it's kind of a little bit like positive feedback, where I think what it does, you have a cell secretes a hormone, that hormone is targeted back at that cell, and that cell's probably going to secrete even more hormone, and so forth and so forth. So it's sort of like a positive feedback thing. Okay, and you can have multiple hormones having an effect on at the same time on one target cell, right? And that's kind of what this next slide here is about. We're talking about multiple effects of hormones on target cell. Okay, so let's just, we have synergy. There's three effects that I'm going to talk about, right? And again, I say multiple hormones, so, but basically I'm sticking to two hormones. The effect of two hormones on one target cell is what I'm talking about. So we have a synergistic effect where two hormones are acting synergistically on the target. So I have two hormones, and both of these hormones must have the same function if it's going to have a synergistic effect, right? And each individually is going to have a certain effect, but their combined effect is going to be really, really greater than the sum of their individual effects. Okay, what do I mean by that? Let's look at these two hormones, epinephrine and norepinephrine. Two separate hormones, right, that target the same target cell. And they have the same function, which is to, on the heart that is. Let's say their target is going to be the heart, and both of these hormones are going to function in the same way and increase the heart rate, which we talked about this in lab before. That's nothing new to you. They both increase heart rate. So I'm saying here, if you have both of them in the blood, they will, a combined effect will be really high, will be great, super high to increase the heart rate, as opposed to like the sum of their individual effects. So here's an example. Let's say epinephrine increases the heart rate by 10% if you have it in the blood. By itself, epinephrine increases it by 10%. Norepinephrine by itself increases the heart rate as well, but it increases it by 20%. So here's the question. If both epinephrine and norepinephrine affect the heart rate at the same time by increasing the heart rate, now how about they're together? Because I'm telling you separately what they do. What if they're both together in the blood at the same time? Does that increase the heart rate by 30%? Because after all, isn't 10 plus 20, 30%? So I'm asking you, is the combined effect increasing by 30%? It does not. Because I just told you, if it's synergistic, the combined effect is greater than the sum of their individual effects. So if you combine it, I'm going to make a number up. It's 70%. See? Their combined effect of 70% is greater than if I would have added their individual, would have given me 30. Here, this gives you 30. And it doesn't work that way. They are synergistic. In other words, together, they work much, much better than if they were working individually, right? Because even if you combine them, it is not going to equal 30. Much, much greater effect. They're synergistic. That's what synergism means. Can we do just one more, this last slide, this last slide. Antagonistic effect is when two hormones have opposite effects on each other. They inhibit each other. And we just talked about this one, insulin and glucagon, right? They have opposite effects. One raises blood glucose, one lowers blood glucose levels, right? They have opposite effects. And just to remind you, insulin, we already talked, will lower the blood glucose levels by taking all of that glucose and making glycogen. Glucagon does the opposite. Remember when glucose is you make glucagon to raise it by breaking down glycogen. So they're opposites of each other, right? Here's another example is calcitonin, which I told you decreases blood calcium. And this other one, parathyroid hormone, PTH, does the opposite, increases blood calcium levels. Okay, they have opposite effects, these two hormones. Okay, let's stop there and then I'll